it's getting sunnier and sunnier. Most of us would rather be outside than inside. Welcome to this event, this symposium, Multiculturalism Without Guarantees, the Integrative Anti-Racism Alternative. This symposium is being put together as part of the celebration of the 50th anniversary of the Faculty of Education at UBC. And the idea for the symposium came from a brief conversation I had with George Day, and I'll say a little bit more about that later on. But it quickly became more than our original idea was to invite him here to give a talk. And then it became, well, why don't we do something around that? And I work with Tom Patch, who is the UBC Associate Vice President for Equity, on a committee that I can never get the full name of, Tom. The President's Advisory Committee on Discrimination, Harassment, and Equity Issues, or something like that. And Tom and I had a few chats, and we've agreed to co-sponsor this event. And two other people that really helped with thinking through some of what this might be, Hartej Gill, and also Leslie Roman. And so I just want to welcome people to the event, and I'll say a little bit more about this. Tom, do you want to say a word of welcome?
Just a very few words of welcome on behalf of the Equity Office. Equity issues are discussed too little on this campus. Sustainability and global citizenship seem to have greater currency these days. One of the goals of the Equity Office is to promote, to broaden the discussion of equity on campus. And, so I was very pleased that a few months ago when Handel first approached me and talked about the idea of collaborating on some speaker series or events. And I was particularly pleased when he came and expressed interest in co-sponsoring this event. I hope it's the first of many collaborations, and look forward to the panel today and to the presentation. Thank you.
Well, the idea behind the symposium, the notion of multiculturalism without guarantees, I'm borrowing from the work of Stuart Hall, who did some work on blackness without guarantees and Marxism without guarantees. And Stuart Hall was in turn borrowing from Antonio Gramsci. And the idea of without guarantees is the idea that you might have the correct politics, you might have the right agenda, you might have the correct cause, but it doesn't mean that the things that you do in the name of that cause are always correct. So this is a caution to those of us who do kind of social justice work. That's the notion behind Stuart Hall's idea of without guarantees. The idea that just because you have the correct politics doesn't mean that the things that you're doing to get to the end game are the correct things. So we all believe in a kind of version of multiculturalism in Canada that we might want to subscribe to, but how to get there, especially in a climate now of all kinds of forms of discrimination in Canadian society. But especially after 9/11 and after the 7/7 bombings in England, the kind of backlash against multiculturalism. So one of the things I want us to think about today is whether in fact multiculturalism today ought to be up for grabs, whether there might be another alternative. And that alternative might well be an integrative version of anti-racism. So that's sort of the agenda for today, and most of you will have had a copy of the agenda and something on the back if you want to become an associate of the Center for Culture, Identity, and Education, of which I'm director. Please contact Caroline Rockert. She's there. Nothing happens without Caroline, so if you don't contact her, it doesn't get done. I'd now like to welcome the Dean, Rob Tierney, who has been very supportive of the work of the Center for Culture, Identity, and Education, and generally, so many different programs, and in a kind of time of austerity, has managed to put together some smashing events in connection with the 50th. Rob?
Well, thanks very much, Handel, and thanks, Handel, for your efforts in putting this together. We had a wonderful day, it feels like a couple of months ago, but quite a while ago, African Awareness Day, which Handel organised, which was extraordinary as well. I really appreciate the leadership. I also really appreciate Tom and your support, especially over the weekend. 50 years is an interesting marker for us. It gives you a chance to look back. We look back to actually when we were declared a faculty. Some people thought as if they were discriminating against education until the faculty was established in 56, when all of a sudden we quickly became the third largest faculty on campus with an intake of 900 students in one foul swoop. There's a little more to that than might appear. But the faculty has an interesting history. The different things that have emerged over the celebration, I think, have been extraordinary from my perspective. We have a history of, in a sense, taking, I think, a leadership against discrimination. Nancy Sheehan, I think, followed up by Jean Barman, talked at length about the extent to which the faculty took leadership against gender discrimination. And Jean, in her comments, from what I heard from some of the emeriti female faculty, just talked about the tip of the iceberg. We suspect, we not only suspect, we know that gender discrimination still occurs, sometimes unknowingly, sometimes in all sorts of different sorts of ways. But it's great to be in a faculty which I think has taken significant leadership in that area. Leslie, with Tom's support, taking a leadership in terms of disability, bringing David Roach to campus here. And, David's presentations, which all I hear about is the transformative quality of David's presentation and David's presence in terms of introducing people to their own tendencies and to really think about how to move ahead with issues of advocacy against discrimination against disability. And then what was probably most forceful for me was the opening where we saw the Musqueams came. And I think it was a historic moment on campus. The Musqueams were basically sort of saying to us through the fact of education, this was a moment which in a sense repairs some of the past undoings. Events which have taken place where there's been a disregard for the Musqueam. And I'm still struck at our opening where the first Musqueam speaker who stepped forward was a direct ancestor of the chief who welcomed George Vancouver. And what's striking to me is that this First Nation chief welcomed George Vancouver. And then how poorly we position the First Nations. The silent years, the loss of their culture, and other sorts of things. The next speaker getting up and being asked at one point in time this was a Musqueam chief, what he thought about the raising of a totem pole on Musqueam land. And he said, I didn't know about it. I heard the drums, but it's not a Musqueam totem pole. And how the university in different sorts of ways can do things which are incredibly disrespectful to First Nations. Well, it was an amazing event. A week ago, I was sort of dealing with a similar sort of form of, I think, leadership that our faculty, on behalf, I think, of the university is doing. And that is our faculty are the group that's sort of leading the charge against ageism. And one has to sort of see in ageism the microcosm of a lot of issues around racism. Whether one sort of perpetuates racism, which I find morally problematic, on the basis of economic rationalisation. One only has to be reminded of those sorts of issues were undergirding the battle around apartheid, the battle around civil rights. And we as an institution, I think, need to take the lead from our colleagues and sort of say, we don't care about the economic consequences. We really need to stop practicing discriminatory practices, whether they're based upon gender, race, age or whatever. So I just find it fabulous to be part of the 50th. I find it great to be, in a sense, finishing our weekend of the 50th with a conference which takes us the next step, which moves us to really thinking about how we act. I also find it interesting, as an interesting marker, because some of you probably know what March 21st is. The International Day for Elimination of Discrimination, elimination of racial discrimination, which was first celebrated or declared by United Nations, I think in 1966, 10 years after our establishment, but also I think about 6 years after the horrendous outcomes of the peaceful Sharpeville demonstration. And so it seems really fitting here that about 10 days ago in Geneva, there's an international conference in commemoration, but also dealing with these issues. And for us to, in a sense, continue those discussions here today, I think is very timely for us in terms of our 50th, but incredibly timely given the tendency of countries to sign on to the Convention of Elimination of Racial Discrimination. But somehow we have to go beyond discrimination to a sort of a proactive orientation to all sorts of differences. And while we have a Charter of Rights, somehow I sort of think the Charter of Rights is sort of how we defend ourselves legally. And as educators, I think our goal is how do we turn something from a defence into a sort of proactive stance that moves us ahead in such a way that we don't have to defend, but we're in a place of supporting, so that we're not sort of coming out of a hole or a rut. We're sort of building a mountain. So Handel, thank you, and it's wonderful to have George here. Some of you may know I tried very hard to get George here more permanently several years ago, and so it's great to have you here. You don't realise it, but we may be locking the doors. Thank you, Handel.
Well, two corrections that I'd like to make to the program that we have. One is it should read, and most of the notices that went out did read that this is kind of co-sponsored by the Equity Office. And Tom, I hope you won't hold this because we'll be collaborating a lot, so this is going to be a regular thing. The second thing is that one of the panelists on panel 4, Lynn Daniels, her designation should read Aboriginal Education Program Consultant at the Shoe Education Center, Burnaby School District. I said a bit about the idea of multiculturalism without guarantees before. Let me just say a word about the Integrative Anti-Racism Alternative now. Anti-racism in Canada draws a lot on the British model. It was people who were doing radical politics who felt that, in fact, multiculturalism was a little bit wishy-washy in terms of what it is that people really wanted. Didn't address the critical issue of racial discrimination, at least didn't address it strongly enough. And so the discourse of anti-racism was sort of brought up against the notion of multiculturalism, and that's the way it was for quite a while. And the critiques against multiculturalism also have led to critiques against anti-racism itself. And one of the critiques of anti-racism is, well, how can you have a discourse that only addresses race? Because people's identities are a lot more than about race. There's cultural issues, there's other socio-cultural issues of difference. And that has led, so in England, for example, people like Paul Gilroy and Kobina Mercer have leveled critiques against anti-racism, where in England, in fact, it was a kind of version of anti-fascism that really was masquerading as anti-racism. And this, all of this has led to what people are now calling integrative anti-racism. the idea of bringing in other forms of social difference. And it's this version of anti-racism that we want to explore today. And we thought, those of us who had these conversations, Tom and I, Hatej and I, Leslie and I, we talked about the idea of representing various kinds of elements in an occasion like this. That's why we have panels on the administration, what UBC is doing about anti-racism. We also have panels on what faculty and graduate students are doing. And Rob has mentioned in the indigenous populations, and I'm very interested in the intersection of indigeneity and anti-racism and what that might look like. So we have a panel on that. And we also have a panel on how this plays out in terms of teacher education and in terms of actual classroom practice. I want to take a few moments to introduce George Dei. He sent me a brief bio, which of course is not very brief, because George has done so much. But before looking at this kind of official thing, I want to say that I've known George since he first got a job at OISE. He was the first black and the first African professor at the Ontario Institute for Studies in Education. And I was a graduate student there at the time. And he was literally living in this fishbowl. Everybody wanted to see, can this African actually be a professor? Can he do anything? You know, and must have been a very trying time for him. So I regard him as kind of one of the pioneers. And George was one of the first people and one of the foremost people in terms of doing anti-racism work in the field of education. And all of this we're having today came about because I was sitting in my office and I decided, why don't I call George? It's been forever. And I called him up and he was away at a conference somewhere and I left a message. And he called back from his conference saying, you'd called, did something happen? I said, no, I just called. I know you're very busy. You're always everywhere around the world, but at some point it'd be good if you'd come to UBC. And he said, oh, you've never invited me. I said, well, if I invite you, will you come? He said, just tell me and I'll come. And I thought, wow, he's usually very busy. So I guess it was an academic version of you had me at hello. Those of you who don't get that really ought to rent more movies. But anyway, a more kind of academic version of this intro. George is from Ghana, where he did his undergraduate education, and he did his postgraduate studies at McMaster, where he did an MA, and at the University of Toronto, where he did his PhD. He's currently professor and chair of the Department of Sociology and Equity Studies at OISE. And between 1996 and 2000, he served as the first director for the Center for Integrative Anti-Racism Studies at OISE. So he might know a thing or two about what we're talking about. His teaching and research interests are in the areas of anti-racism, minority schooling, international development, and anti-colonial thought. His educational research includes a 3-year SHIRT study that he did titled Making Excellence Accessible and Equitable, the examination of best or exemplary practices of inclusive schooling in the Ontario public schools. And the report of that is coming up in a book, appears in a book that's already published, Removing the Margins, the Challenges and Possibilities of Inclusive Schooling. And he's also done Inclusive Schooling, a Teacher's Companion to Removing the Margins. Other published works by George include Anti-Racism Education, Theory and Practice, published by Fernwood in '96, Hardships and Survival in Rural West Africa, Reconstructing Dropout, a critical ethnography of the dynamics of Black students' engagement. He's co-edited 3 books, Indigenous Knowledges in Global Context, with Bud Hall and Dorothy Golding Rosenberg, Power, Knowledge, and Anti-Racism Education, a critical reader, and anti-racist feminism, critical race, and gender studies. And well, there's a lot more to it. 7 recent books, Playing the Race Card, White Power and Privilege, Schooling and Education in Africa, The Case of Ghana, Critical Issues in Anti-Racist Research Methodologies, Anti-Colonialism and Education, The Politics of Resistance, African Education and Globalization, Schooling and Difference in Africa, and most recently, The Poetics of Anti-Racism. Ladies and gentlemen, Professor George Sefa Dei.
Well, let me also begin by saying I'm very, very glad to be here. I know, as Handel said, it looks like it's so nice how we find time to be here. You know, I don't want to say much about Handel. By the way, I used to call me Dr. Handel, right? We go way back, as you said. But I'm very, very appreciative of the fact that you invited me. But also inviting me and getting Leslie to comment and also to speak. In fact, I would rather be listening to Leslie than listening to myself. But I think it's very, very great that I have colleagues here in the audience whose work I admire, whose scholarship have influenced my thoughts and my ideas on how we talk about anti-racism and issues of anti-colonial thought. But I also want to mention Carolyn Rocket for the work that I've done in this field. We've been doing back and forth email essays on this, and I want to appreciate that. And of course, I thank you for sharing some ideas with me. There are many in the audience, I can't mention your name, but I know in terms of scholarship and our work, paths across. So, to me, the intellectual journey is a journey of sharing, a journey of also being able to be humble in our claim to know and work with others as we see questions of justice. Let me just share a couple of things to some ideas with you as I contextualize my paper. And as Rob said, as chair of the department, my term ends this coming June 30th. So as one of the, what do you call it, the tradition of when chairs end at the University of Toronto is we invite external consultants. So we have people come from US and then somebody from Europe, and of course somebody from Canada to review the department at the end of my chair. So the reviewers, when I met with them, said, you know, George, your department, as the Department of Sociology and Equity Studies, prides itself as being, quote, critical. Now, what do you do with those who are not critical? So I told her, well, we are not only critical, we are also cutting edge. So what we do is we just cut them out with the cutting edge. But I think to me that was very, very poignant in terms of the work that we do. But at this same conversation, I mean, I remember the external consultants also mentioned that in speaking to the graduate students, they kept talking about how the chair was very accessible and so forth, right? Until they met the pre-service students. And the pre-service students, we've had a struggle trying to integrate them to the graduate studies. Right? So they kept asking the external consultant, you keep saying George, who is George? Right? Basically to speak to the idea that as far as they are concerned, George may be to the graduate students, but they are not integrated in that much to be able to know who George is. But the reason I'm saying this is basically to make the point that when we talk of integrative anti-racism, while we are seeking for the intersections, it's also important to recognize that our intersectional analysis maintains blind spots. Like even when we claim to take race, class, gender, sexuality, and disability and work with them, we all maintain blind spots. And we need to be very frank and admit that. I don't think the intersectional analysis do justice. And this is where the notion that I'll speak about later in terms of integrating anti-racism, its scholarship and politics is clear. It foregrounds race. It foregrounds the notion of race. In order to distinguish it from anti-oppression analysis. So the politics and the scholarship, or the intellectual engagement of foregrounding race is critical in the way we articulate what integrative anti-racism also. Just last week I was also speaking somewhere and where I talked about some of the notions about how we work together collectively and how we talk about collective responsibilities. And there was the kinds of questions that came from the audience. One of the questions had to do with, well, how can you avoid anti-racist discourse also becoming a very racist discourse? So the thesis was anti-racist racism. That's the question that was being put to me, that anti-racism can also have a tendency. And that was because I was critiquing questions about whiteness, the notion of white privilege. I think we need to be very, very cognizant of this, but we also need to be aware of what we're saying when we talk of a critique of the dominance of whiteness. That is not a form of racism. That this thesis of anti-racist racism is just very, very problematic because of a refusal of people to hear what you're saying, what you're talking about. You know, somebody also said, you know, the notion or the word anti, I have a problem with that, right? Why don't you call it something rather than anti? Well, excuse me, we say anti-war. Do you have a problem with anti-war? So why is that when we talk of anti-racism, people will say that is too confrontational? I think we need to be very, very frank about that. If you don't like anti-racist or anti-racism, then it starts to reason that you like racism. There are no two ways, there are no neutral points. This idea of racialized neutrality is itself the problem. The notion of racialized neutrality is itself the problem. And we need to look, in order to deal with questions of racism and other forms of oppression, we should name them for what they are and implicate ourselves and implicate communities in that process. That is very, very important in that. As somebody who, does research, not only in the schools, but also engaged in community politics, I think for me, when I speak to you on the notion of integrative anti-racism, I'm bringing the experience of working within communities, researching in schools, and also being in the academy and dialoguing with colleagues and friends on how we work together on questions of social justice. I think I bring a community to know, or a community of knowing in that engagement or that calling of anti-racist education. And it's very, very important because I think here, this is something that when Tom was making his remark, caught my eye. Because I think to me, in 1903, the W.B. Du Bois had said, the problem of the 20th century is the problem of the color line. Well, I want to rephrase that. I think the problem of the 21st century is the conceit of globalization. The problem of the 21st century is the conceit of globalization. What it means, what it's come to mean. I always tell my students, globalization is what is yours is ours, but what is mine is mine. And that's how some people refract it. And that to me, I think, is the conceit of globalization, and that's what it means for questions of social justice and how we talk about it. You know, there's a powerful liberal discourse at the moment that is co-opting many of the key words of anti-racism, anti-oppression, equity, politics. So we hear notions about excellence, competence, standards, quality, responsibility, and they have been co-opted by a neoliberal discourse without centering notions of equity in how these notions have been taken up. So for example, in my work in the school system, when we talk about excellence, excellence has come to mean you gear schools towards the best and the brightest, without having a very comprehensive understanding of excellence. Similarly, when we talk of responsibility, responsibility is seen in terms of how you maintain physical or fiscal responsibility, monetary, without looking at what are our responsibilities to communities, diverse communities. And so this attempt to co-opt this discourse of the neoliberal discourse, we co-opt some of the progressive activities of equity social justice movement. I think needs to be called on the carpet in that process. One of the things I do in my anti-racist work is I try to see the connection between anti-racism and also questions of indigeneity, indigenous philosophies. And here I just want to, because I think to me it's very, very important that we cannot engage in any space on anti-racism without contextualizing questions of indigeneity and what it means. And here I just want to make a couple of points. Look, racism is not situational. Racism is not situational. And we talk about it being systemic, structural, and endemic in our institutions. So we have to go back to history. And we go back to history, and I think in our context, right, we have to talk about Aboriginal genocide, for example. Residential schools, the colonization that took place in these communities, and how that itself provides a body of knowledge about what anti-racism is. Of course, there's the African Mafia, or what some of us have called the Holocaust of enslavement. And what this means for the way that we talk about what anti-racism is or ought to be. I think the whole notion about, for example, about last week when we talked about this celebration of the incident in Sharpeville when 69 children were killed in the UN declaring the United Nations. People point to that and say, well, these are the atrocities of racism that we have to deal with. Without forgetting that what we actually have to look at is how racism reproduces itself in different shapes and sizes. And that we don't need to have Ku Klux Klan now. We don't need to have burning crosses. That's not mean the end of racism. I think racism is being reflected in very subtle ways. In the exclusions, in the negations, in the omissions. In whose knowledges count, whose ideas count, whose issues are brought to the front to be discussed. And what are the responses and what are the reactions when issues come to the table for discussion. How do we talk about questions of complexity and accountability when we talk about these issues? It's becoming important. So I think to me, one of the points I want to make in terms of connecting that is to go back to history. That to me, a decolonized anti-racist discourse ought to engage that history that says we have to link it with some of the struggles. And some of these struggles are whether Aboriginal struggles over genocide, issues of African enslavement, the Holocaust of enslavement, or Chinese people and their presence in Canada and what we saw that we learned from that in terms of question of labor exploitation and appropriation. The second point, to me, is also the question of how we bring holistic interpretations to social reality. And I think bringing this holistic, there are so many ways. I think we cannot talk about anti-racism today without looking at the macro social politics. It's not just the cultural politics. It's a macro at a larger scale. That sometimes one of the things that we talk about, that we say we ought to deal with, or we have to confront with, are not just simple things which are here and now, but they are also very, very systemic, institutionalized, and endemic. And we have to be able to connect the minor and the macro issues, and be able to speak about that. I think to me, connecting the macro and micro issues also find ways to connect yourself, the group, and broader questions of community. It's very, very important that we bring that holistic. And this is something that indigenous philosophies also teach us. That to understand social realities, we have to engage a very holistic rendition of what it is that we're talking about. This way, for example, integrative anti-racism cannot just simply be about one thing, but also be able to connect with that holistic interpretation. Then there's also the notion of the multiple knowings. And when I talk about the multiple knowings that we bring, look, the way I speak about integrative anti-racism, or the way I say let's speak about that, it will be different. We will come from different entry points. It doesn't mean George is right and Leslie is wrong. But I think it's very, very important to work with the idea of multiple knowings and how we speak about it. And to me, to work with the idea of multiple knowings, we have to address the tension between what people have called epistemic relativism and what I would say epistemic saliency. I'm not talking about epistemic relativism. I'm talking about epistemic saliency. In other words, those who have been oppressed bring a particular understanding to their oppression. It doesn't mean that they are the only people who can speak about that. But it's very, very important to hear that voice. To hear that voice. The voice of being oppressed, whether it's along the lines of class, gender, sexuality, disability, language, or culture. Okay. And that's what I talk about epistemic saliency in that. Then there's also the notion of difference and how we think of difference. You know, one understanding of difference is to see difference in terms of trying to strike hierarchies. But I think integrative anti-racism works with the notion that difference has to work with thinking in circles rather than thinking in hierarchies. Thinking in circles. Because once we think in circles, we begin to see the relative strengths that we bring to the discussion, rather than simply seeing difference in terms of the hierarchies in that. And of course, the notion about identities and how identities are very, very important when we talk about this. Okay. Who we are, where we have been, where we are located, questions of positionality, all implicate the way we produce knowledge about particular discourses. I think it's important also for us to acknowledge that. Before I move to talk more about some of the theoretical underpinnings of integrative anti-racism, I also want to make a couple of points. And I think, to me, when I talk of the connection between indigenous philosophies and anti-racist practice, or anti-racist scholarship and thought, I think it's important for me to engage certain questions because of where I'm coming from, the questions of schooling, for example. I mean, one of the things we're dealing with in the school system has to do with the question about how do we ensure that our institutions, and when I say institutions, schools, colleges, universities, or the workplace, the labor halls, the check places, and so forth, how do we ensure that our institutions respond to the diverse needs and concerns of a wide body politic? I mean, we look at our institutions, we are not homogeneous, they are heterogeneous. In each of our bodies, each of our constituencies come with different concerns and needs. So how do we address that? And some of these concerns move beyond simply material. They move to the non-material and other aspects of our life. So basically the notion of bringing the holistic condition becomes important in that. Secondly, something that Hannah alluded to, and the question of how do we talk about excellence? And I say why do we talk about excellence in a way that says it's not simply accessible, but it can also be equitable. And by that what I mean is we have a tendency where sometimes we do look at excellence as something due to the individual achievements, rather than forgetting that excellence is actually the product of collective. There's so many, as I said earlier on, there's people who, have influenced me. Some people who have read my work. I talk about how students, for example, have been very influential in my thought. Right? I think we need to acknowledge this, that excellence is not the individual production, but it's one due to the collective. But we are so caught up in the way we talk about excellence that we are so individualizing. And it's little wonder that we have school children in the school system at the moment who will simply insist, this is mine, without talking about my responsibilities to each other. And then of course the question of bodies and how bodies are able to identify or develop a sense of connectedness and belonging. Whether in terms of what we call the nation, what we call the school, or what we call the institution. How are different bodies going to be able to articulate a sense of connectedness and belonging? And again, to go back to the school system, sometimes we have students who are present physically, but they are absent in mind and soul. So how do we articulate these notions of belonging and connectedness? And recently I've been trying to write on this notion about inclusion, and how sometimes it's been co-opted not only by the neoliberal, but it also becomes so problematic the way we talk about it. Inclusion has meant continue to add to what already exists. That's the dominant conception of inclusion. It may be okay, but I think I'm moving away from that. And the reason I'm moving away from adding to what already exists is because what already exists is the source of the problem in the first place. What already exists is the source of the problem in the first place. So you add to what already exists, you add to inclusion. So let's talk about another take on inclusion. That says, let's begin anew. And this again is a part of that anti-racism that should bring to the discussion. Now, why anti-racism before I move to debate anti-racism? Why anti-racism? Here, look, there's this idea, and I'm beginning to, it's part of what I call the popular rhetorics, right? That let's move beyond race. Let's move beyond race. Well, isn't this something that we, and I think to me, the frustration that I find is, how do you move beyond something when you haven't addressed it? People talk about overcome, and part of that is connected when we say, oh, people have overcome race. I don't think the question is overcoming race, right? It's how people use their resistance and agency to address the problem. We still have to deal with the problem of race and the connection with racism. So to me, this rhetoric, this popular rhetoric, about going beyond race, we need to subvert it. And here it's very, very important because, look, race is an essential element of Canadian citizenship. And by the same way too, race, class, gender, sexuality, ability, disability, they are critical dimensions of how we talk about the nation state. And we cannot just simply say, well, let's move beyond one of them, one of the categories. Because race, class, gender, sexuality, disability, they are all essential critical components of talking about questions of nation state, questions of belonging, questions of citizenship, and how we're able to articulate our connections with that. You know, I was reading some of the works by a colleague of mine, and he made the point that, you know, what is happening now is that we talk about multiculturalism today is that it has made race irrelevant. Multiculturalism as well. And I'm asking, well, we have to basically interrogate that. Irrelevant for whom and how? Right? There's a distinction that needs to be made in terms of when people do that intellectual gymnastics and put race in the closet and say, well, it becomes irrelevant. As far as I'm concerned, it's not. It is the tendency of people just maintain a silent gaze on it. And that doesn't make it irrelevant. I think people know how to claim race, how to engage in representational politics around race when it suits certain interests. And I think we should be able to speak on that position rather than say, well, race is relevant for women in power. And it becomes very important. Then there's the hostility to race. There's the hostility to race. And a lot of us have written on the notion of the hostility to race, but I think it's very important to, now when we talk of the hostility to race, it's how sometimes we want to hear about everything else. You bring race in and you meet with resistance and hostility. I've always made the point that anytime somebody says, this has nothing to do with race, you know the response? You can bet your bottom dollar, it has everything to do with race. It doesn't mean it's all about race. It definitely has something to do with race. It's very important. And I think it's very important. I think we need to separate the discomfort of speaking race from the urgency of addressing the racial problem. I think there's a discomfort, and because sometimes what people see is that people may bring an essentialized, a fixed, and bounded interpretation to race without looking at the complexities, the fluidity of that. And I agree with that. I think we need to move there to say it's not a fixed category, it's not a bounded category. But we also have to look at it that as we ask or interrogate the facility of race and ask for bringing complexity to that, we don't move into the gate that says, simply forget about it. So dangerous, it's a slippery slope when we do that. And I think to me this hostility must be affirmed and critiqued by conflating the urgency of addressing the racial problem with the discomfort of speaking race. As I said also, racism is not situational, it's endemic in institutions. There's also the question about the place of race in the understanding of oppressions. And this is again something that anti-racist discourse brings very clear in that. That oppressions have certain things in common. All oppressions, whether it's class, gender, sexual, disability, language, culture, oppressions, cultural forms of oppression. They all work within structures. They are intended to establish advantage, disadvantage, to create these individual distinctions. They create the self and the other distinctions. So it's very, very important for us to acknowledge that. But I think in critical anti-racist work, it's also very important to work with the idea that while oppressions share many things in common, depending on where one is located, they are not equal in their consequences. They are not equal in their consequences. It's very, very important. Sometimes I know people have difficulty with this, but I think later on when I articulate it, there are kind of opinions of integrative anti-racism, you see where I'm coming from with that. Then the notion of whiteness, which is also critical in anti-racist work. That whiteness, despite the way whiteness is complicated by questions of class, gender, sexuality, ability, disability, and so forth. Whiteness, to me, we have to maintain the gaze of whiteness as also a system of dominance. As a system of dominance. And I think to me, maintaining that gaze on whiteness as a system of dominance, I see it in many ways in terms of where sometimes the seduction of whiteness and white people becomes very clear in the academy. And then the seduction takes different ways in terms of how we talk about meritocracy. You know excellence if it looks like you. We talk sometimes about merit and who basically is qualified to do what. And what are the yardsticks, what are the standard measurements that we use in that. And it's so surprising that I've seen sometimes some of my own students, right, they will mimic Eurocentric knowledge in order to gain acceptance and credibility. And this is again something that. And lastly, in terms of why anti-racism, and this is something I've been working on late. It's a question of, can goodness and racism coexist? Goodness and racism, can they coexist? And I would say yes. goodness and racism can coexist. And I think we have to work about the possibility of them coexisting, because then we move away from that defensiveness. I don't think, and I say this, I don't think any teacher gets up in the morning and says, I'm going to be bad. I don't think, maybe one or two, I don't know. But I would work with the idea that I'm going to be bad. Right? But I think they work within institutions and structures. Right? In the effects of the practices that they engage in. And not simply racialized, they have racist effects in terms of body type. I think to me it's very, very important for us. Now, all what I'm saying is leading me to ask a couple of questions in the way we begin to theorize integrative anti-racism. I think, for example, within the academy, we have to ask a question about what are the possibilities within the academy? What are the possibilities? At this historical juncture, what are the possibilities at this historical juncture for every learner to escape racist, sexist, classist, homophobic, and hetero-patriarchal ideologies? What are the possibilities of the learners escaping that? That's when we ask these questions, we begin to talk about our responsibilities. But what are the possibilities at this historical juncture then for the learner, for every learner, to escape racist, sexist, homophobic, hetero-patriarchal ideologies? Secondly, how do we challenge the fact that most of our students are set in their ways of thinking about the curriculum? Most of our students, they are set in their ways of thinking about the curriculum. I think they see the curriculum in a particular way rather than look at it in terms of what some of the critical theories I've talked about, people like Joe, when they talk about the curriculum becomes a path to follow. So it creates the possibilities to make changes. When you have students and sometimes some educators who are set in their ways of thinking about the curriculum, and anything else is seen as special interest. If you want to talk about these issues, that's where you have an agenda. That's where you begin. Rather than begin to ask yourself about the way we should rethink the curriculum. Define broadly, not just simply just what's the text, and even the way we produce knowledge, the way we engage instruction. And then the question of how do we understand the ways racism, sexism, homophobia are traveling within the current global context. We talk about the globalization of racism. So racism is just simply what happens here within, say, Canadian relations among these constituent groups. But also we have to look at it in terms of how racism, questions of what is happening on the continent. Well, questions of, say, for example, in the Darfur region, when you look at what an Arab minority basically brutalizing the black African majority. These are forms of racism that we need to talk about, the globalization of racism. Questions of ethnic cleansing that we need to speak to that. And then how do we bring race and difference back into our discourse? How do we bring it back into our discourse and discussions? I think what I say this because what I've noticed is that, particularly in the academy, you have the tendency of acknowledging difference without responding concretely to difference. So, so a dean will say, well, our faculties are becoming diverse. Or the president of the university will say, well, University of Toronto, we have so many students coming from different backgrounds, and that's an achievement. But that's only one thing. What happens to the different bodies when they come? What happens to them? How does the curriculum reflect on the changes that are taking place? How do we sustain the different bodies when they come? So we have to move away from this tendency of simply acknowledging difference. And then begin to respond concretely to difference. And this again is something that I think to me when we begin to theorize integrative anti-racism that we need to talk about. So let me move now to some of the things I want to point out in terms of theorizing integrative anti-racism. You know, one of the frustrations, notwithstanding the expansive literature on anti-racism and integrative anti-racism. In fact, the notion of integrative anti-racism, when I used it in 1986, but before then, if I remember in the piece that I've written about integrative anti-racism, making the point that although that's the goal that we need to talk about, there are some limitations because I don't think we can be able to work with all the categories. And we want to be very frank and put it out there of our limitations. all discourses must put their, not only their problems, but their limitations also up front. It doesn't mean that we don't strive there. But one of the things that I've felt over the years is that the whole discourse of anti-racism sometimes is held to a different standard than others. So we hear, sometimes when people, you hear George, you hear Handel, you hear Leslie speak in certain ways. But we are going to be read differently. Some of us, we are always going to be heard as saying what? Race. When we seek to make connections with class, gender, sexuality. It's sometimes beyond our control. It's beyond our control. But I think we need to recognize that there's that project that is taking place. And so we hear questions, some of the critics talk about, well, race lacks analytical scientific studies. And because of that, they equate that to a lack of theory, what we mean when we talk of an integrative anti-racism. Now, I just want to point to a couple of things here in terms of the way. Obviously, I think to me, the whole notion about, and one of the reasons why I think integrative anti-racism becomes very important is that we need to look at the asymmetrical power relations that exists when we talk about things of class, gender, sexuality, and so forth. That asymmetrical power relations. I think also very, very important not to confuse race saliency with race reductionism. We confuse the two. There's a difference between race saliency and race reductionism. Race reductionism is when you begin to say everything is just simply race, end of story. Right? But race saliency is a politics of a particular entry point where you maintain the gaze on race and begin to read the other oppressions through the lens of race. So you begin to read class, gender, sexual, disability oppressions through the lens of race. Because it is called integrative anti-racism. There's a politics that requires that we foreground race. But it doesn't mean that you just stop there. And that's the politics. That politics requires that we foreground race, the way we talk about its intersections. So I want to highlight a couple of things that we need to bear in mind as we begin to theorize integrative anti-racism. And the first point has to do with that. Despite the lack of scientific analytical studies, it ought to be acknowledged and realized that race has discursive, communicative, political, and material significance. Despite its lack of scientific analytical studies, it ought to be recognized that race has discursive, communicative, political, and material power or currency. Secondly, theorizing anti-racism, integrative anti-racism also requires the understanding that race and difference are imbricated, they are connected. Yet, in anti-racist theorizing, we have to maintain the foreground of race. Now, although race and difference are imbricated, questions of class, gender, sexuality, language, religion, and so forth, they are integrated or imbricated. I think it's very important still to maintain our gaze on race. So race becomes in the foreground. Now, the politics of anti-racism requires that we put race in the foreground. Otherwise, if you can't do that in anti-racist practice, where can you do it? You can't do that. I think to me, it's no brainer.